Random Arc Entertainment presents ReD, Book 1, The Dark Pale Perspective, written and performed by Lashley-Johnstone. Chapter 38, New Recruit, 2017, Chicago. Special Branch was nothing but a designation, a subtle designation that banished the fear of the truth. This particular agent of this branch of speciality knew, however, that banished fear would return in earnest. It was nearly time for them to come out of hiding again. For the first time. Again. Preparations had already begun for the first of surely many devastating battles of attrition. Retribution. James Rooks was a man of experience. He had lived through many small and large-scale conflicts, some remembered and feared by all, most erased and known by none. Rooks had helped save the country and the world he loved so much 1,000 times over, and the occasionally grim irony of it all was that nobody even knew he existed. Not the real him, the man underneath, the man that mattered. He came from a place that normal people couldn't see, and if they can't see it, perceive it, they won't bother entirely believing it. Couple that with an ironclad legend and an official yet fake high-ranking position in the security corps, and you've got yourself a cover story. In reality, at least in Rook's reality, he was a teacher, a great teacher, and he had more than thousands of students who would happily testify to his capabilities. But there were also surely thousands more deceased targets who would gladly testify to his students' capabilities, if they still could. Right now, though, by order of his superior, a being he'd never liked, Rooks was playing recruitment officer. Apparently Rooks and the rest of his branch of speciality needed some outside help for this extensive mission. Some fresh blood. Rooks was in the back seat of a black BMW X5, reading over the briefing notes that had been sent through to him via an encrypted email. He was tapping on the keyboard, also using the touchscreen tablet that was connected to the keyboard to flick between the pages of the report. One of his extensive technical team had sent a probe over to Washington, D.C. ahead of their arrival, and the information it brought back would surely spread terror all across the globe. It had begun. Bloody hell. He wasn't exaggerating, he said, increasing the speed with which he flicked through the photographs that the probe had sent back to him through the submission platform. Because it was being controlled by the tech boys here in Chicago, they could use it to tap into the security footage within the Capitol. The footage it sent back was certainly interesting. Horrid, twisted bodies, blood smeared on skin and teeth. Some living, some dead, some transformed. The fact was that since the EMP blast they had no live coverage of the area. The probe had just managed to send back footage before the blackout, but after the detonation, everything went dark. Luckily, the images and information could be recorded from the control center. The probe itself must have shot off and died along with everything else in the blast radius. The tech department were still trying to determine the severity of the EMP detonation, whether or not the power would return, and if so, when. A blackout can, more often than not, make infiltration missions more or less complicated depending on how the universe was feeling. The saying, information is power, was obviously true. In this case, however, where there was power, there was information, there was connection. And as of a couple of hours ago, their connection to the action had been severed. The probe was now probably lying lifeless on the steps of Capitol Hill. The fact that without power the probe would no longer be detected by any possible outside source was a positive, but it was as invisible to their own scanning equipment, which did cast a little cloud over that ray of sunshine. Rooks also knew that the quarantine wouldn't hold, and it frustrated him that he and his troops would possibly be going in blind, but he had to make do with what he had. He had no idea who had set off the EMP, but that was one of the many things he hoped to discover upon entry. He exited the car and stretched. He pulled out a pack of cigarettes from his inside jacket pocket and lit one, savouring the taste. He was standing outside Central Police Station on State Street, waiting for his newest recruit. Rooks had read up on the man's skills, and concluded that he was the ideal man to have at his side to assist with a possibly broader tactical perspective. Marek's case files indicated they had a strong ability to separate out every single problem linking to an investigation and determine who was best suited to solve it in the fastest time, suggest creative ways to split responsibility between the people he regularly worked alongside. A natural leader who seemed to want to remain at a lower level of authority, despite his eligibility for various higher level positions in other departments. His strength, so his file indicated, was interrogations, his natural sixth sense for internal deception. It didn't matter that he was a newbie. It didn't even matter that he was a purebred human. It was Rook's job to make the transition as quick and as smooth as possible. The new recruit's name was Robin Marek. He was young, headstrong, brave and smart, a somewhat unorthodox and relatively successful detective. Adaptable was the word that flashed through Rook's mind as he leafed through the electronic copy of Marek's service record and psychiatric profile. As he locked the tablet screen, Rook saw Marek exiting the station. Rook's ex-colleague and lifelong friend, Captain Benjamin Foley, had briefed him on the kid's past, going beyond the profile, and he knew that he had to be careful. "Colonel James Rooks," he said, stopping a couple of feet away. "That's right, detective," replied Rooks, putting out a hand. Marek shook it and asked the inevitable question. "Why are you bringing me in? Why me?" Rook's thin lips twisted into a smile. "Because you're special." "What do you mean?" Marek looked confused, understandably. "That's all you need to know, for now." "No, it's not," said Marek, his voice slightly raised. Rooks could feel the frustration within the young guy building. He sighed and leant against the car, still smoking his cigarette. "Look, kid, I've been asked to bring you in to assist with this operation. That's all I can say for now." It wasn't all he could say, but he didn't really fancy giving out confidential information outside the Central Police Department. True, the people that Rooks worked with and for ranked high above the police, but he wanted to play it safe for now. "How are we getting to Washington? The captain said something about borrowing highway patrol cars?" "That was the original plan, yes, but due to the amount of gridlock there's bound to be on the ground and the subsequent blackout, we're going in by air." Marek nodded, then frowned. "Who's we? Who the hell are you people?" he asked, now deciding to stand closer to Rooks. "I'll explain in the car," he replied, stubbing his cigarette out underfoot. "Come on, get in," he added, opening the door and climbing inside. Marek looked back at the police station. Rooks knew he was making a final decision in his head. Did he stay, or did he go? Would he come back? But what Rooks also knew was that the kid didn't have a choice. No doubt realizing this himself, Marek turned and walked the short distance to the car. He climbed in, taking one last look behind him. Unknowingly, and somewhat bluntly, Robin Marek closed the door to his past. Chapter 39. Love or Monsters, Part 2. From the moment he opened the door, he knew he was going to die. He could feel it. The marble halls of this White House that once filled Doug Harrison with promise now filled him with nothing but dread. He knew what he had to do, and he couldn't stop now. She was out there. It was out there. He raised the gun and pointed it into the hall outside the door. He could hear nothing and see nothing apart from the blood on the wall in front of him. What had once just looked like an unintelligible smear in the yellow emergency lighting now looked like a word. Was it a word? The blood splatter held him for a few seconds, but his concentration was broken by a loud banging noise coming from his right. He froze. It sounded like a chair falling over, or a large stack of papers being dumped on a wooden table. Sounds all too common in a place like this. But given that he knew he was the only human in the building, the knowledge of the source of that sound made him sweat even more. Now pointing the gun in the direction of the sound down the hall, he walked sideways towards the blood smear, looking at it, then in the direction that the gun was pointed, and then back again. His eyes narrowed as he tried to make out what it said. Was that an M? The light above that illuminated the bloody wall art was unnaturally bright. Doug tried to rewind his mind back to his first ever security briefing. He remembered one of his many advisors, whose name and face he could no longer recall, telling him that the emergency generators that powered the emergency lighting in the White House were located at the east side of the building. He, of course, was currently in the West Wing. It seemed like a stupid idea to go all the way to the other side of the building just to dim the lights in order to read a word that was written in inhuman blood, but he still had to find a way out of here. There was no way he was being stuck inside one of the safest places on Earth when something inside it clearly wanted him dead. Thanks to the blackout, however, the doors that connected the halls in the building and the doors into each room would now be unlocked, so at least he would have places to hide if he needed to. There was also bound to be some more weapons somewhere in here. He was almost sure he had been given the locations of the weapons caches as well, but his fogged brain was unable to locate the memory. He crept forward, taking one last look at the word, and started walking quickly. He realized he was heading in the direction of where the noise had sounded, and that filled him with even more crippling sickness in his stomach. He came to the end of the corridor, shivering against the slight chill in the air as he stopped at the half-open door. The blackout had no doubt knocked out the heating, which pissed him off. In a quarantine situation, people should at least be able to stay fucking warm. The half-open door loomed up at him in the partial darkness. If he made a run for it, he could get across the corridor and into the central hall. He prepared himself, taking several deep breaths and cracking his neck, then broke into a sprint. The sound of his shoes against the marble floor rang loud at his ears. When the door that led into the central hall came into view, he raised the gun. He knew that whatever that thing was, it would be able to hear his movements. Whatever its reason for leaving him alone, Doug somehow knew that it wouldn't be for long, but he roared anyway, with both anger and determination. He burst through the door, almost daring to dive into it. The central hall was dark and even colder, the emergency lighting far dimmer than in the narrow corridor. He pointed his gun frantically in every direction, at the same time listening out intently for any sound of movement. He heard nothing. He power-walked down the central hall, past the library on the left and the china room on the right. And that was when he heard the sound, coming from directly behind him. He spun around to see that thing. It was almost galloping towards him at an enormous pace, with the body of a predator still growing in size. Although Doug wasn't sure whether that was because of the bulging, pulsating muscles and pustules, or because of the ever-increasing proximity. The uncertain staggers and jolts he had seen it move with earlier completely abolished. Doug screamed, firing off 2 shots towards what had once been the love of his life. What the hell was she? In the darkness, he couldn't tell whether any of his shots had actually hit the target, but he suspected not because the creature picked up speed, now screaming with rage. The sound almost sounded like a cross between a baby dinosaur and a vampire bat. Doug was running now, heading for the door at the end of the central hall that led into the east garden room. Ahead, he could see the door was closed, and was, not so silently, praying that it would be unlocked. His shoulder came into contact with the door, which, because of the momentum, sent pain shooting down his arm. He grunted with exertion, then reached down to try the handle. Locked. How the hell could it be locked? Why the hell was it locked? God damn it, he whispered, stealing a glance behind him. That thing was meters away. He looked down at the gun. If he shot at it to break the lock, he would be able to get through, but if he did that, he couldn't shut it from the other side. This was all happening in the space of 10 seconds, and he shook his head to concentrate. He fired another shot in the creature's direction, this time hitting it in the stomach. The creature slowed and stopped, cradling its wound and growling. Doug knew that it wouldn't stay stationary for long. He swung the gun round two-handed, pointed it at the lock, and pulled the trigger. The handle went flying off. One of the screws bounced back and caught Doug in the cheek as it blew past his face. "Fuck!" he gasped, before kicking at the door. It swung open, and Doug sprinted through, hearing the creature running again. He bolted down the east colonnade, past the family theatre on his left. While running, his mind travelled back to the occasional hour he used to spend in there, once a week or so. He would sit down with Sarah and watch old home movies that depicted happier times, when they were a family. Him, his wife, and his daughter. His daughter. Even though he was caught up in this mess entirely of his own making, and not knowing whether or not his daughter was even still alive, he decided in those few seconds he was going to get out of here, and he was going to do it for her. He came to the end of the east colonnade and turned right, again almost diving through the door that led to the staircase that took you up to the Senate floor. Right now, though, he was focused on getting to the generator room, not the one that housed the main power sources of the White House, because they were independent power sources now, but the other one, the one that controlled the emergency lighting, heating, and other things similar. He had shut the door that had led into the staircase, so at least it bought him some time to both get to his objective and hide. A seemingly unimportant door that took you down to the emergency generator room appeared on his left. He opened it, thanking God it was unlocked, and rushed through and shut it behind him. The staircase he was now heading down was covered in darkness. Once he found the entrance into the generator room, however, he would be able to see what was around him. He pulled his lucky zipper lighter from inside his jacket pocket and sparked up a flame, changing the gun over to his other hand. The stairs were dusty and badly in need of a clean-up, but there wasn't many of them, and he soon came to the door that was constructed from the same material as the surrounding walls for camouflage, like most of the secret rooms on the ground floor of this White House. Also unlocked. His luck was, in some respects, holding. Doug squinted against the bright, yellowish light in the room. As his eyes adjusted, he noticed a 19th century style key on one of the tables that sat in front of the generator control panel. Doug guessed that this would be the key to the room he was in. He grabbed it and slid it into the lock that was positioned above the door handle. It fit, and he turned it, hearing the telltale clicking sound which calmed him down ever so slightly. He put his back against the door, shut his eyes, and slid down on his ass, breathing heavily, the tension coursing through him. He opened his eyes and regarded the room. The control panel looked complicated, and he hadn't even thought about the fact that he might not know how to use any of it. What he did know was, for now at least, he was safe. But the thought of for how long, and once again the thought of his daughter, was what made him rise up and head for the generator control panel. Chapter 40. Now you see me. Monsters? Real fucking monsters. Danika had watched virtually every horror movie you could think of, read a lot of comics, created a lot of her own artwork surrounding the whole idea of seemingly mythical creatures. And they are depicted as mythical and monstrous because, well, humans don't look like that, walk like that, scream like that, bleed like that. Danika immediately knew that this darkness had been forced upon them. These normal people. Was the darkness internal or external? Did it matter? To see these creatures live and up close was another thing entirely. True, solid, gushing forms of evil. Blackish red tendrils extending from once human fingers. Dripping red liquid pain. Cracked, peeled skin. Danika tried to think of a better suited name than zombie. Monsters? Hostiles? The enemy? She was so focused on naming the creatures she was examining from a distance that she failed to sense the being watching her, mere yards away. Moments earlier, after considerable, and to some extent angry, coaxing from Martin Baldwin, she had prepared to exit the AV. He had seen her start to shake slightly, more with adrenaline at that time than fear, and he had just stared at her, blankly, unmoving, clearly not knowing what to say, what to do, as if she was the alien. There were plenty of humans out there like that, and Danika had grown used to those people, but Martin only looked human. She knew he wasn't, not fully. Perhaps her expectations had been too high. She had just assumed that being a genetically altered being would do more than just make him incredibly clever. She was wrong, or at least she thought she was. Regardless, there was a feeling of caring inside that she had for him that she couldn't quite explain, much like her growing affection for Arkham, although that seemed to be built on more, and she actually liked him. It seemed to her that if Martin did care about her at all, he was making a concerted effort not to show it, because when the cold air had rushed her warm skin upon exit from the AV, it only added to the feeling of loneliness that she was all too used to, even with a genetically altered field man right behind her. Danika didn't know whether Martin was able to defend himself in the same way that Arkham was able to. The amount of weapons and gadgets that Arkham Void had been carrying on him ever since he had changed from his wrecked leather denim outfit to his armor-plated gear made it all too clear to the naked eye that he was more of a fighter than a thinker. Martin gave off a different sort of vibe. Arkham was a soldier. Martin was more of an engineer. Because they needed to time the jumpstart exactly right, in two close yet separate locations, Martin had provided Danika with an inner-ear comlink. Limited range, limited battery power, suitable for their current needs. As soon as Danika's eyes had fallen upon the plethora of creatures coming towards her, their proximity increasing with a vengeance, she knew she had to defend herself. Arkham had perhaps intentionally left one of his favourite guns in the back of the AV, a gun which he had to verbally wrestle off of Baldwin. He was whispering violently at her, saying that she didn't know what she was doing. She was out of her depth. All too familiar platitudes. But what the hell did he know about her? Nothing, because he hadn't taken the time to find out. Granted, she hadn't told too much to Arkham about her own past either, but she was going to. She had to. After making sure that the gun was fully loaded, she pointed it outwards, two-handed, holding it close to her chest and pulling back the hammer. It was heavy, and she knew that she would have some difficulty making her shots accurate. Danika's past was full of close calls, near misses, but she had always managed to come out of it in one piece. Just. Inside the car, Martin silently worked away, making sure that all of the internal processors were properly prepared for the system restart. If he didn't compensate for all the variables caused by the electromagnetic interference, they wouldn't be going anywhere. Similarly, if the key that he had provided Danika with to access the manual restart via the outer bodywork of the car was the incorrect one, his incredible affinity for mathematics wouldn't amount to anything either. Danika was taking cover behind the AV on her hands and knees now, searching frantically for the appropriate panel gap, finding it purely by chance on the third sliding attempt. Turning the key 90 degrees clockwise, a metallic click sounded, causing another underside panel inches to her left to drop to the ground, followed by a thin, lightly rusted lever. Danika exhaled, gripping the lever in preparation as she looked again to gauge the proximity of the horrors surrounding the car. The creatures that were struggling in an ungainly pile towards the AV did not just consist of the gushers, as she had decided to name them. There were walkers as well, all too reminiscent of extras from the Walking Dead TV show. But they seemed to be running slightly. Walkers don't run, Danika said to herself, quietly, momentarily forgetting about her comlink.
What?
Said Baldwin, who was now peering out of the driver's side window. He saw what she was referring to, and his breath cut off for a couple of seconds.
Do you know what they are?
She asked, now raising the gun in the direction of the gaggle of unknowns.
I would think.
Martin paused, then raised his own knife.
Stage 2.
Danika took a deep breath in. What about Arkham? Inside the car, Baldwin stood up, clutching the battery in his left hand and the knife in his right.
Don't worry about Arkham. Let Arkham worry about Arkham, trust me. That's what he's bloody trained for.
There was a pause, and Danika could hear various keyboards being hammered over the comlink.
10 seconds,
Martin said, sharply. Danika counted down the seconds in her head. They seemed more like minutes. Hours. Waiting. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Now!
Shouted Martin, and with all the strength she could muster, she pulled the lever in the direction of the creatures. There was a sputter, then a groan, and then the AV kicked into life. Yes! Danika exclaimed, almost jumping in the air for joy, but that joy was short-lived as she froze and swiveled her head slowly to the left. She nearly screamed when her eyes met with the black and yellow bulges. Even though those eyes weren't human eyes, she recognized the look within them. Pure animal rage. She jumped back, rolling across the damp ground before firing off 2 shots directly into the thing's midriff. This wasn't one of the gushers, so she didn't have to avoid any of the crimson fluid, but she still knew she couldn't let it touch her. The creature went down, then writhed around in seemingly deep, animal pain. This gave Danika a sixth sense of satisfaction, mixed with uncertainty. Had she killed it? Maybe. But she didn't have time to think about that. She needed to get out of here, and fast. She shot up and looked behind her. There was nothing there, so she went round the corner of the AV with the gun pointed in front of her, heading for the back entrance. Just as she was about to step inside, she stopped, looking around. Martin. Where was he? Danika continued slowly around the other side of the AV, stealing a glance ahead. What she saw made her freeze again. She couldn't see Martin, but what she could see was the crowd of creatures. They had stopped. They were just standing there. Just fucking standing there. What the hell was happening? Why had they just stopped? Were they waiting for something? Shit! She exclaimed. Where the fuck was Martin? She looked at the crowd of unknowns again. The gushers were standing in a line behind the walkers, the liquid that was oozing from them covering the ground underneath and in front. This was no doubt some kind of defense mechanism, which meant the red liquid was something that she definitely wanted to avoid. Suddenly, 3 more walkers, who had previously been momentarily frozen along with the rest of the crowd, began making their way towards Danika, as if somehow ordered by the ones standing behind them. She raised the gun again and fired off 3 more shots. She brought one of them down with her second, but narrowly missed the other 2 with her first and third. Were these like scouts, maybe? Doing the dirty work of the gushers to make sure the road ahead wasn't too dangerous? Were the gushers important but vulnerable in some way? That, and the question of where Martin had vanished to, made her bow her head and shake it in near exhaustion. She looked up at the walkers again. They were getting closer. She cracked her neck and brought her concentration level up, trying to banish the fear of utter loneliness that was creeping into her mind. She closed her left eye briefly to focus her vision, aiming at one of the walkers' heads. "Come on, Dee," she said to herself. "Concentrate. It's all about finding your center," came a familiar voice from behind her. She jumped and swung around, pointing the gun at the voice, but she recognized that voice half a second later and immediately lowered it. "Not to mention controlling your reflexes." "Son of a bitch!" "I cannot argue that." "Where the hell have you been?" "Investigating. Saving people. The usual." Danika sighed heavily, and she felt a smile creeping across her face. "May I?" "Sure," said Danika, putting the gun back in the hands of the rightful owner. The deadly twins now reunited. Arkham Void raised them both either side of Danika's head, pointing them at the 2 remaining walkers that were advancing menacingly towards them. "You might want to cover your ears." Danika did as she was told, and a second later, hell, half a second later, he fired. Danika watched as time almost slowed down. The bullets flew through the air, each one flying in the direction of the 2 separate targets. Arkham was aiming for their heads, and he hit them both, bringing them down instantly. Danika uncovered her ears and looked up at Arkham. "How long have you been watching me?" she asked. Arkham smiled slightly. "Long enough." Danika put her hands on her lips. "And you didn't think to announce yourself? You know, clear your throat? Maybe a little cough?" "What can I say? You look great from behind, and I was testing your reflexes." "Did I pass?" "You certainly didn't panic, which is good. But sometime soon you might not have the luxury of finding a friendly face on your 6. Next time, you have to be prepared to fire." "I was prepared." "No, you weren't. For one thing, you put the safety back on after you shot that second walker. Actually, you flicked it back as soon as you knew it was me standing here. Still pointed at me, though." "Interesting. Okay, so I wasn't totally prepared." "Always flick off the safety before you go into the zone, and keep it off. Otherwise it can kill concentration, not to mention spoil the moment. Now let's get out of here." He put out a hand. Danika took it, and the familiar feeling of safety washed over her. Then she remembered. "Where's Martin?" she asked, as they walked quickly to the back entrance of the AV. "What do you mean?" said Arkham, frowning. "He's not in here?" He peeked inside the AV. "No," she said. "I checked. He vanished before we came back online." She hung her head. "Fucking hell." "We'll find him," Arkham said, somewhat optimistically. "How can you be so sure?" Danika asked, entering the AV and shutting the door firmly behind her. "I know him. He can handle himself." Danika sighed and sat down, pulling out her cigarettes for a much-needed smoke. "He said the same thing about you. So we're seriously just leaving?" "Yep." Arkham was now sitting in the driver's seat, fiddling around with the controls. "Was he right?" Danika lit a cigarette as the car started moving. "Well, yeah," she said. looking at one of the now working wall monitors. One of them was hooked up to the camera feed on the outside. She gazed with wonder and confusion at the still stationary crowd of monsters. She looked away and said, "But he's not like you." Arkham chuckled. "We're more alike than you realize, D. It's just the conditioning that varies. I'm geared more towards full frontal attack and protection. He's more build stuff and push buttons. The instinct to protect the self is also off the charts in his case." "Oh, is that why he can be such an asshole?" Danika said, with a hint of jest in her voice. "It could be." Arkham grinned slightly. "Where do you think he is? I mean, he literally just vanished." "He's most likely exactly where he needs to be." "And where's that?" "Not where we need to be." "And where do we need to be?" "Not here." "Are you being intentionally annoying?" "Possibly." Arkham sighed then. "I'm sorry, I'm just a little on edge." "It's understandable. Citywide blackout, missing friend, infected, gushing monster thingies. I swear to God, for the last 10 years I have just been waiting for something like this to happen. And now that it's finally here, it sounds weird, but I'm almost a little relieved." They didn't say anything for a while after that. Then all of a sudden Arkham broke the heavy silence. "I think I understand what you mean," he said, before pausing again. "But that's not why I'm on edge. I mean, it is, but there's something else." "What is it?" "We can't just go storming into the Capitol building, guns blazing. We'll have absolutely no idea what we'll find. Well, we've got some idea, but that some idea that we've got isn't a good sum." "You're right. We need more information." "We don't just need more information, we need backup. An experience of a man with more than 2 eyes." That last part sounded pretty cryptic. "Cryptic. I suppose that's one word for him." "And what would another word be?" "Ass. Seriously, you thought Martin was bad? Wait until you meet this guy." "And this guy is?" "Another old friend of mine. He's a doctor, of sorts. But we got displaced, scattered. It's complicated. Lost contact a long time ago. But everything going on here is sure to draw him in. He'll want to be as close to the action as possible." "How do we find him?" Danika asked, the science fiction geek within her registering certain words in Arkham's sentence. Words like displaced, scattered. Possibly referring to the shift technology her and her old division had found only partially readable files of a couple of years back. Arkham grinned again as the car picked up speed. "With a little bit of luck, and probably a whole lot of blood."